Here to learn about power meters and power training, and we have one of the best in the business. Will from TriHard is one of the top coaches in the area who presents seminars after seminars, as well as writes for various magazines like Triathlete Magazine. So he's going to be here to present tonight. This is not about fit work. This is about power meters and you guys learning. That's what we're here for. Just a quick question, and maybe it's a question you're going to ask.
No, fire away. I think I know where you're going.
How many people already have a power meter? So quite a bit. Okay, and so how many people don't have one but are thinking about it? Okay, excellent. How many people are using a power meter but don't know how to use it? Yeah, awesome. All right.
Can I throw one additional?
Yeah, go ahead. It's all yours. All yours.
Thank you.
For Will.
No, you don't have to. Well, thank you guys for having me come out, and also the place does look amazing actually. Now that you say it, looking down the floor, it's like walking into the garden. So this is impressive. Thank you guys too for coming. Hopefully we'll be able to give you some good information tonight. We're gonna split the night up a little bit. I'm gonna work through some of the nitty gritty, if you will, and then when I'm done, we're gonna do a little question and answer period where it's going to be the three of us, basically, Marty, Dean, and I, fielding questions you have and hopefully being able to give you some answers. Kind of piggybacking before I get into things on what Marty was talking about, those of you that have a power meter, how long, out of curiosity, how many people have been using it, say, more than a season? Okay, how about 2 or 3 seasons? Okay, so just a few people. Okay, cool. Just trying to get a better read on, you know, how much you've been into it, how long you've been using it, how thoroughly maybe you've been using it. One last thing before we get rolling. The piece of paper that I handed out to most of you, hopefully everybody got one. If not, we have a few more up here we can hand you later. Basically, within about 2 or 3 days, Jason and I, my business partner, will have a presentation with speaker notes on our website, and you'll be able to download it, save it, print it out and burn it if you decide you wanted to, or you can use it as a reference down the road as well. There's also some additional information. When I get a little further along here, we're talking about some workouts and things. I may note something like doing pedaling emphasis drills, and rather than trying to really dive into that, the additional information that's going to be on the website will explain that for you and give you some details there. I think that's about it. So I'd say let's get rolling here. Whoops. All right. So we're going to talk about what power is, why to use it to train, how to do some field testing so you can figure out where you're at and where you need to go. And then we're going to talk about performing and reviewing workouts and races as well as we go through the night here. So let's talk about power output. These are Marty's legs. So who said right? Charge him an extra 15%. All right, so what is power output? You know, we read about it, we talk about it, throw it around when we're talking to buddies. Basically, power output is force times velocity. And when you're riding your bike, what that means is how hard you're pressing on the pedals and how quickly you're spinning them. So if you go out for a ride right now and you're riding up a hill, you can make the same amount of power by either holding a specific gear and spinning it at a different rate. Let me think of a good way to describe this here for a second. Say you're trying to hold, I'm going to say 100 watts. Watts is how we're going to refer to power when we're talking about cycling. So you're going up a hill or you're riding down the road and you're trying to hold 100 watts. You could do that maybe by producing X amount of force and spinning at a faster rate, or you could shift gears, go into a tougher gear, pedal at a slower speed, a slower cadence, if you will, but you're putting more force into each pedal revolution, creating the same amount of power. Okay, so you get an idea of how we're going to change how much power we're producing, produce more or less power in different situations. Does that make some sense? Cool. Generally speaking, we're going to refer to power throughout the night here as watts. Every now and then when you're reading things, you might hear watts per kilogram. That's basically getting it to be a relative term. It's saying, you know, for Peg back there, what's her power relative to her body weight, and how does that maybe compare? It gives you something that you compare a little better. You know, maybe comparing Peg to I in raw numbers, what we could do for a specific amount of time, or what we did for the power output in our test I'll get to in a couple minutes. It might look like dramatically different numbers, but how it actually transfers to road performance might be relatively similar based on what our watts per kilogram are. Okay? So every now and then you'll see that listed in various articles and things like that. For the most part tonight, we're going to stick to just straight up watts. All right, so why do it? Why use power? You know, besides coming in here and, you know, hearing these guys preach about how good it is or seeing articles that talk about it, listening to your buddies, why use it? It gives you a really good objective way to assess your performance. It gives you a really good objective way to verify what you're doing in workouts. So, you know, how many people maybe you have a coach, maybe you coach yourself, but you think to yourself, okay, I'm going to do a workout with 30-second intervals, and you're going to work very hard during those 30-second intervals. You go out to do those 30-second intervals, you get done with the interval, and your heart rate still hasn't got to where it was supposed to go. So you're thinking, was that right? And maybe it takes 5, 6, 7 intervals before you're seeing that heart rate really respond quick enough. Power, on the other hand, right away, as soon as you try to do that 30-second interval, I want to be at roughly this power, bang, you're right there. You can see it instantly. During an aerobic workout, where you're trying to hold a pretty steady effort, it allows you to create a range that you can kind of shoot for very quickly and easily. So as soon as you come into a hill, where your heart rate's going to be a little slow in responding, as soon as you start climbing that hill, maybe you need to back off a little bit. But it might take you longer to recognize that if you're just using heart rate, and that could cause you to train a little harder than you need to. Race-like workouts, so you're trying to practice race pacing. Actually, just as a breakdown, how many people in here are triathletes? How many people are cyclists? Start with the triathletes. Wow, I might have biased this a little bit too much equal footing here. Are there any straight-up cyclists at all? Did I miss a hand? All right, cool, a couple people. All right, there will be stuff for you. All right, so you can target what you're doing in workouts. Maybe you're trying to have a portion of a brick workout for your triathletes that's going to be at a race-like intensity. It's very easy to see where you're getting there. You can look back later on and get a sense of what did you do during your workouts. In other words, very clearly you could look back 6 months after a specific workout and ponder, how did that go? I'm going to do a similar workout tomorrow. Maybe it's a race. You could look back and say, I did that, Hyannis Triathlon. Everybody here familiar with that? Or most of you guys? So there's the first one in the spring, there's another one in the fall, same course. You can look at that first one and say, how did I execute that? And have some extra information, better understanding of how maybe you can execute the race in the fall a little better. Or maybe year to year even, just by better understanding the course. So it gives you some more objective information to look at. Now, despite the fact that I'm saying all this stuff about objective information, the thing to me that's probably the most important is that it lets you train more mindfully. This is something that truthfully takes 2, 3, 4 years once you start using a power meter, I think, for most people to really start to grasp. Initially, when we start using power meters, we get really excited by the stuff I was talking about, that ability to be real objective, to really quickly get into a target range or a zone, if you will. And that's great. It helps you refine what you're doing nicely. But long term, if all you're doing is trying to execute very specific things, yes, you're going to get a little better at doing those things, but do you really understand, if you're trying to do a race and your power meter fritzes out on you, what are you going to do? Or if you're trying to better understand how you're producing effort, what it feels like to work at different intensity levels, what it feels like to perform in an event, or if you're in a race and you're feeling really good and you're in a situation where you're saying, I've got all the experience I want to have, I'm trying to set a PR, I'm willing to dig a little deeper, and if that means I blow sky high, I blow sky high. If you're stuck on a certain number and you're not willing to listen to your body, or you can't because you've trained it out of yourself, how does that help you? So although there's a lot of really good objective things you can do with the power meter, and those last as long as you use power, it's important to consider that power is also something that lets you become more mindful. So instead of being mindless and just being a drone to the numbers, and I'm supposed to be at 300 watts, I'm supposed to be at 300 watts, it allows you to learn, kind of get a sense, or calibrate is a better way to put it, your perceived exertion relative to the power output you're producing. Maybe you can start to learn about what I call leg tension. So say you have a particular power range that you're trying to execute on a ride. Maybe that's 200 watts, just random example here. You start to kind of associate, okay, when I'm pedaling at 200 watts, whether I'm doing 90 RPMs or 80 RPMs or 120 RPMs, there's sort of a level of tension that you start to feel in your legs while you're riding. You can create a relationship there. So you start to get to a point where 3, 4, 5, 6 years after you start using a power meter, my hope would be that you'd be able to go out and say, I'm doing this workout today, and if somebody told you, do 5 by 250 watts for 4 minutes, you could go do that workout with tape over the power meter. We look at it after the fact, and it's really close. Okay? It allows you to be more open to the experiences you're having while you're riding, and potentially to have breakthrough performances when you're racing a little bit better than if all you do is focus on the numbers, numbers, numbers. Okay? Very cool. All right, so talked a little bit about what power is and why. How are we going to measure it? There are lots of ways. I used to use math actually before power meters became relatively affordable. Break out a spreadsheet, you figure out vertical meters on a climb, your velocity, your time, and you can figure out roughly your power output. That's pretty cumbersome though, and you can't really carry that around whether you have a smartphone or not. To get to the top of a climb on any road you're riding, it's really cumbersome. So not really useful. You can use websites. You could use a website like BeginnerTriathlete.com, and you can do similar things. Use modeling and try and calculate your power output. Again, not really handy for most purposes. So really what it comes down to when you talk about how to measure power output is either going to be an on-the-bike power meter like these guys here, SRM, PowerTap, or a Quark. The other option would be stuff like Tax or CompuTrainer, indoor trainers, or ergometers that are set up to measure power for you. So it's a few different options. Really though, for the most of what we're talking about here, I'm going to assume that we're talking about an onboard bicycle-based power meter. The reason I like that the best is that you can use it indoors or outdoors, and it's going to allow you to measure your power and monitor that. Use it as a training tool throughout the year, and not be restrained to the fact that you can only use it indoors, or maybe there's a power meter called an iBike, which only really works outdoors. So there's some other options, but generally speaking, if you can afford one type of system to measure power and to use, I would say some type of an on-bike system is the best way to go. All right, so that's some of the nitty-gritty. So let's talk about what you're going to do after you first start using power. For those of you that are thinking about it or have not quite got a power meter yet or just started using it, let's talk about testing and then training and racing. So number one, you've got to acclimate to the power meter. How many people, when you first started using it, those of you that have been using it for a while, were shocked? Like, holy cow, I can go out and do an aerobic ride with my heart rate monitor, and I'm looking at a 5 to 10 beat per minute range the whole day. It never varies more than that. I can totally dial it in, and I'm looking at my power meter, and I think I'm a massive failure because I'm 100 watts one way or another the whole time. It's kind of crazy, right? It's like, geez, this is killing me here. That takes some time to get used to. Similarly, there's a lot of other stuff. There's calibration issues that maybe you have to get used to with various units. You got to learn how to download it. You got to learn how it relates. So going back to that mindfulness thing, when you first start using it, give yourself 4 or 5 weeks. Just do the workouts you were planning on doing. If you've been training on heart rate and perceived exertion, if you've only been training on perceived exertion, just go out and ride. Get a sense of how that thing works. Download it, update it if it's a unit that you can update from the company's website. Really experiment and just kind of play around with it, get a sense of what's going on with that thing so that you can then, once you start really seriously trying to use it, have it all dialed in. You don't find yourself going, now wait a minute, how did this thing sync up with that thing, and where does, it allows you to really feel like you're totally on top of it when you're ready to go. The variability issue is huge, which is why I wanted to hit it again. This is actually a time trial that an athlete that I've coached who's used power for about 9 years now did. I think this was a year ago. And I love it because the heart rate, I mean, it's practically a flat line. I mean, you could almost draw that in there with a pencil, whereas the power is all over the place. And this was really, this is a very consistent effort. It's a pretty well-paced effort. But you can see the variation there. And my point, and the reason I'm harping on it, is because I don't want anybody who's using a power meter to feel like, I have this training range I'm supposed to stay in. I'm constantly 20 watts over or under it. I'm totally killing this. I'm not getting any benefit out of this. That's not the case at all. Okay, your goal when you start using that power meter is to try and essentially say, if I'm trying to be in this area, I want to more often than not see numbers in there. It's almost like in your head you have to create an analytical tool that's going to figure out the mode of what you're looking at. Okay, everybody know mode, so it's the most frequent number that you're seeing as opposed to the average or something. So you can just start to establish this sense of, okay, I'm generally in that area. Does that make sense? Cool. So that's just something to really keep in mind. I'm trying to harp on it because it's, to me, in most athletes that I coach who just start using a power meter or are new to it, or folks that just randomly ask me a question or something, that's often one of the biggest things is they just feel incredibly frustrated, like they're doing something wrong if there's variation, and you're not. So testing. Testing's pretty important. If we're going to use this tool, what are we going to do? And that fit is really good because Dean did it. So that's done. He actually did get faster too after Dean did his fitting. But so the idea here with testing is that you're going to create a known number that you can associate with your level of performance, and you can track it over time. So there's a lot of different testing you can do. You could do what I'd call a ramp test, where you gradually increase the intensity you're working at over some period of time, fixed stages, if you will, 2 or 3 minutes. Slowly increase the power output until you can't continue going. That might have use at times. Overall, though, I find the best option for the vast majority of people is a pretty standard time trial test, 20 to 30 minutes. I happen to like 30 minutes most of the time. Or if you're outside, around 10 miles, okay? The idea is that you're doing a long enough effort that you're going to get a good estimate of what you can sustain, what kind of power level you can sustain or hold. It's going to, I'm trying to figure out a nice way to say this, it's going to smooth out an excessively fast start. So if you did a 10-minute test, you could go out and just completely wail on it and really get an artificially high number. If you go 30 minutes, those first 10 minutes where you really tried to blow the pipes out and think you were a hero result in the final 10 minutes where you're wishing to your mother that you hadn't bought a power meter and this is horrible and trying to figure out a legitimate reason to stop. So the key thing though is that you're going to be able to establish training ranges and establish a baseline that you can track and monitor every 6 to 12 weeks, more or less depending on who you are, what you're doing, to get a sense of where you are year to year and month to month, or I shouldn't say month to month, but throughout the year as you progress. So indoor and outdoor tests, most people tend to have a slightly different power level indoors versus outdoors. There's a few reasons that float around for that. Nobody I've ever talked to has given me a reason that they seem to feel fully confident in, which is a little frustrating because it doesn't really make sense from a physics perspective. If you can do 200 watts, you should be able to do 200 watts. It really doesn't matter. Whether it's where on the bike the power meter measures power, if you're measuring power closer to the pedals, it might be a slightly different number, very small, than say at the tire. The other issue is when you're outside, you're rolling, so you have some momentum. When you're inside, it's just your rear wheel spinning, which is a lot less momentum. Maybe that makes it harder to produce power. But for whatever reason, sometimes indoors, people have a slightly different power range. So if you're unsure, do 2 tests. Okay, do 1 test on your trainer, especially if you ride a lot indoors or it's the winter. Do 1 test outside. And they're very similar. Indoors, 30 minutes, basically flat out as fast as you can, a time trial. So it should be a sustainable effort, but about as hard as you can go for 30 minutes. If you're outdoors, basically the same darn thing, but about 10 miles. Okay? So this testing is giving us that baseline I was talking about. It's also going to allow us to create training zones. Some people call them training ranges. It's sort of tomatoes, tomatoes type of a deal. The main point is that a training zone is something that's going to give you an area of focus. So it's going to give you a chance to say, okay, cool. I've got a specific goal for some workouts that I'm doing. Maybe it's to improve my Olympic distance triathlon performance. Maybe it's you're a time trialist and it's to improve your quote unquote threshold a little bit and allow you to sustain a higher power output. Maybe you're a road cyclist or a mountain bike racer or cyclocross racer, and you've got a race where there's frequent massive accelerations where you're going to be hitting very high power numbers for 5 to 20 seconds over and over and over again. So what kinds of things is it that you need to work on and you need to develop and build and kind of blend together to create the most specific fitness for you? Zones are really the thing that allow you to do that. They're the thing that allow you to put focus in your workouts and bring that work to a head, if you will, allow you to develop it over time and not just allow all the training you're doing to be kind of one area and create sort of a muddled, I can go this speed type of fitness. That sort of makes sense? Somebody please go like this. Yes. All right. So this is the chart that was intended to put everybody to sleep tonight. I don't expect anybody to try and read this whole thing right now. Don't worry about the details here. The idea is that you could go home, you could look at that, and you could do some math or create a spreadsheet, calculate your own training zones off of those tests that I talked about. I'm going to refer to Joe here throughout the night. Joe is our imaginary athlete, Joe Watt, and his time trial power output was 200 watts. So this is just breaking this out. Now, some of these ranges, there's a couple people here that I coach, they're probably looking at them going, I don't remember seeing that before, and that's because some of this is stuff that I only use with cyclists, some of it's stuff that really is only used with triathletes. For example, I wouldn't use half Ironman race intensity with a cyclist. So there's some differences there based on the specific sport that you're doing. The idea is just that you have those ranges, you can have in mind, okay, cool, I'm going to try and, I did this test, I'm going to execute the test well, and then I'm going to look at the power numbers, come up with the ranges like Will was talking about, and I'll be able to target my training a little bit. And as we get into workouts here in a couple minutes, this will start to make a little bit more sense than just being a big old chart. So we've got now testing. We understood why we were going to measure power, what it is. Let's go ahead and take a look at types of workouts that you can do to help increase your fitness overall and that you can use that information and how that information is applied, whether it be pacing, execution of the workouts that you're doing. There's a few variables that people will talk about when they're referring to power training, and really they find their root in Cycling Peak software. If you use a power meter and you don't have Cycling Peak software and you coach yourself, buy it. I'm kind of one of those people who resist telling people to buy things. I'm a Yankee by nature, I guess, so it's sort of something I resist. But if you use a power meter, go ahead and buy the Training Peak software. Regrettably, a lot of the power meters out there come with software that, that's about the best I can say for it. The Cycling Peaks or Training Peak software, they've done a very good job, and you can integrate it if you have a GPS or something else as well. So you can kind of bring all your data into one place, which is nice. If you have a coach, they probably use it, so you're off the hook, but everybody else, I'd keep that in mind. So average versus normalized power. Normalized power is something that you can find in that software. There's a few others now that will use it, but the difference basically is average power is going to look at the average of what you did while you were riding. So if we think back to, where did I go? This ride, right? It's all over the place. So if we're going to calculate an average, we're going to be taking numbers like this one, and we're going to take numbers like that one, and these guys down here, and this might be smoothed a little bit. I can't remember when I copied this if I had smoothed the data and made it look a little smoother as opposed to quite as jagged. It's possible that there were some peaks and valleys that were a little higher and lower. So if that's the case, that average number is not going to really reflect quite as well what actually happened. Whereas normalized power is going to take the average that you're creating while you're riding and essentially form a rolling average off of that. So it's going to reflect a little bit better what you're doing when you're riding. Remember earlier how I was talking about when you do an interval, your heart rate doesn't really catch up on time? Your physiological reactions to the work you're doing are a little delayed. They're kind of behind. So you do the work and your body's like, okay, cool. It's like a credit card payment. I gotta do this work and I'm going to pay it off. So it kind of delays the process there. So normalized power gives you a better representation of what's actually happening. All right? So for the most part, going forward, if I'm looking at a workout and I'm referring to something, I'm talking probably about the normalized power that's in that workout. And if you are at home and you're looking at your own workouts, use that versus average power. It's going to give you a better representation of what you did on that workout, and it'll give you a better handle on how you performed there. Now, another reason for that is that it, wow, on my screen it's like totally green and blue. So this one just surprised me because it looks so dull this way. But so another reason why the normalized power is important is because it will factor into some other calculations and some other variables that are pretty commonly used when looking at power data analysis, okay, or looking at what you can do with different softwares out there and kind of breaking things down. By the way, for those of you that, how many people are Mac focused and not PC focused? Okay, for you guys, check out Golden Cheetah, which is a similar system to the Cycling Peaks, but works on a Mac format. So these additional metrics, functional threshold power, a lot of people probably hear about that reading magazine articles or talking to their buddies. Functional threshold power is basically 1 hour time trial power, if you want to really boil it down. How hard can you go for an hour? Let's look at that number. Okay. The reason that's important is that it kind of factors into some of these other metrics. Intensity factor, which is basically a ratio of your normalized power, what I was just talking about, to your functional threshold power. So you do a ride, we look at it after the fact, take a look at the workout and say, okay, cool, this was indeed, as you know, a pretty hard ride, but as a coach, I'm not sure. Maybe you look back 6 months later and you're like, I don't remember if that felt hard. You can highlight it and find out. So intensity factor is going to give you an idea of how hard the ride was, basically on a scale of 1. So if you're under 1 by a good margin, 0.75 to 0.95 or so, that's going to be a ride that feels pretty aerobic, pretty mellow. As you start getting 1 and higher, it's going to feel like a very intense workout. And if it's getting much over 1, it's definitely one that you'll remember, at least for a few days. Variability index is one that I think is important for people, especially early on when you're learning how to use a power meter and you're kind of trying to figure out, for example, like that muscle tension thing I was talking about, or simply just getting a better handle on trying to meter out your effort. Power's all over the place, highly variable. Variability index is going to look at your average power versus your normalized power and going to give you an idea of just how much you were all over the place. Similarly, you want to be close to 1. Closer to 1 you are, the better off you are. But this is where we have some divergence here, whether it's cycling or triathlon. For those of you that are cyclists, there are events that you're going to do that should have a high variability index, and if it didn't, either you were in a breakaway and riding really smoothly, or something was going on funky. Maybe you were off the back and riding very smoothly. For example, a criterium should have a pretty high variability index. A lot of corners, big accelerations, cyclocross race, mountain bike race, a circuit race or a road race that has frequent turns. Some triathlons, you can get a better handle on the course. If you can hijack power files from friends, maybe from random websites, if you can find some other coaches, there's some web forums where you might be able to network a little bit and get yourself some power files, even through your triathlon club if you're a member of one. St. Anthony's jumps to mind down in Florida. That course is practically a criterium course. It's turn after turn. So that's a triathlon course that may have high, you would get a better understanding of that course by being able to look at it and recognize this has a higher variability index. Make sense? Whereas on a pretty standard, I'm gonna say a standard triathlon course, relatively few turns, pretty consistent effort, or a time trial course, you really want to be at a close to 1 level on the variability index. You don't want to be all over the place. It should be a pretty even amount of power output throughout the day. And then last, TSS is short for training stress score. Basically a way to assess the challenge of that workout, the total physical stress of that workout. So if you go out and you do a workout and you looked at a number that was, say, 100, that would be about the equivalent of doing a 1-hour time trial. So it goes back to this functional threshold power thing here again. If you did a workout and had a training stress score that was greater than about 150 up to about 300, that's a pretty tough workout, probably take a couple days to recover from for most people. You get over 300, 350, that's a workout that'll take a little while to recover from, 2, 3, 4 days. And when you start getting much above that, we're talking about something that you might want to call it a season on. That's exaggerating, but at least give yourself several days to relax a bit. So these are some general metrics. The ones that are going to be most important going forward here, the rest of this presentation, are going to be normalized power, more so than, or is going to be normalized power more so than anything else. I just want to make sure everybody has at least heard of and thought of these things, because once you start getting more into it, and if you start using the WKO software, which I would recommend again, these things will start to take a more firm shape in your mind. You'll be able to use them within your workouts to assess what you're doing a little bit better overall.